The film begins with a band playing at a cafe on an island called Island. The cafe owner, whose name is Alvarez, really likes the lead singer of the band, Nora. He even invites her to sit at his table. He also compliments Nora's beauty and her singing voice. He's so impressed that he offers her a 1-year contract with 3 times the payment to perform at the cafe every Saturday night. At that time, Nora is thrilled and agrees right away. Soon after, Alvarez asks a bartender to bring some wine for Nora. Unfortunately, the bartender accidentally spills the wine on her dress. Fortunately, she's okay with it and says she can change clothes, but Alvarez is not happy. He's hosting an important guest and doesn't want them to see someone with a stained dress. Shockingly, he cruelly kills the bartender right in front of Nora. This terrifies Nora, and she realizes that Alvarez is a dangerous person. It turns out that he is actually the leader of a powerful mafia in America. He's been living on the island for 4 years to expand his illegal activities there. Now the scene moves to Los Angeles. There we meet the police chief named Mark and his deputy named Phil. At that time, they're undercover as fake bad guys, planning to do shady deals at the airport. Soon after, the real dealer and his buddy show up. Mark goes up to the dealer to nab the illegal stuff, while Phil gets ready to hand over the money. But suddenly, Phil turns the tables, attacking the dealer's buddy and causing a big fight. Then, Mark's phone rings. It's his mom calling from their hometown. She tells him that his brother has been found dead. Hearing this terrible news, Mark rushes back to his hometown, which is actually on the island of the island. In no time, Mark arrives and attends his brother's funeral. He finds out that his little brother was the bartender who was killed by Alvarez the other day. Mark's mom is devastated by the tragic loss of her youngest child. Rumors are going around that gangsters might have killed Mark's brother when he was coming home from work. Even Alvarez and his 2 henchmen show up at the funeral to offer their condolences to Mark. Once the funeral ends, Mark and his mom head back home. At that time, he takes a look at old photos of him and his brother. He realizes it's been 11 years since he last set foot on the island. His police chief duties kept him away. He swears to himself that he'll get revenge on the person who took his brother away. The following day, Mark headed to the island's police station. He went straight to the police chief, who turned out to be his childhood friend B. They were clearly well acquainted. B offered his condolences for Mark's younger brother's death and promised to start investigating the case promptly. Mark inquired if B had any leads on the killer's identity. At that time, B explained that they only knew the killers were gangsters, but tracking down which gang was responsible would take time due to the number of gangs active on the island. While there, Mark bumped into Akila, a female martial arts trainer. Interestingly, she was his ex-girlfriend. She was visibly happy to see him after 11 long years. At that time, they caught up, and Akila expressed her condolences for Mark's brother's passing. Mark asked her about his brother's routines and which gang might have been involved. Akila mentioned that she wasn't sure about the gangs, as many had arrived after Mark left the island. However, she knew that his younger brother worked with an American guy named Alvarez. She revealed that Alvarez was more than he appeared, cause he was actually a mafia boss. The cafes he owned were just a front, case his real business involved illegal goods and weapons. Learning this, Mark grew suspicious of Alvarez and decided to confront him. Before leaving, Mark asked Akila to take care of his mother and bring her home, fearing for her safety. Not long after, Mark went to Alvarez's cafe. However, he was initially stopped by Alvarez's right-hand man, but Alvarez himself allowed Mark in. Then, Mark wasted no time and asked Alvarez if he knew who was responsible for his brother's death. At that moment, Alvarez came up with a story, claiming that Mark's brother was killed by outsiders when he was returning from a night shift. Mark wasn't convinced and warned Alvarez that he would never forgive him if he was involved in the crime. Alvarez responded with a laugh, brushing off Mark's threats, especially since he was just a regular cop. Then, Alvarez gave Mark the location of a cafe where gangsters often hung out. He suggested Mark ask the gangsters there, as they might know who was behind Mark's brother's death. After Mark left, Alvarez instructed his right-hand man to gather gangsters from the north to take care of Mark that night. Meanwhile, Mark paid a visit to his best friend who ran a hot dog stand. He asked about some weapons he had left with his friend. His friend explained that he had buried the weapons in an empty building near the beach. As the story unfolded, it became clear that when they were teenagers, Mark and his best friend were like leaders on the island. But after he left for Los Angeles, the island attracted foreign gangs and mafia who wanted control. Mark's best friend realized that Mark would seek revenge for his brother's death. So he was ready to assist Mark whenever he needed it. After that, Mark headed to a deserted building near the beach and dug up the weapons his best friend had buried. As evening came, Mark arrived at the cafe Alvarez had mentioned. He quickly turned off the music and confronted the gangsters about his brother's killer. However, they didn't take kindly to his accusations and attacked him, leading to a brawl. Remarkably, Mark skillfully managed to overcome them. With the gangsters subdued, Mark once again demanded to know who was behind his brother's murder. The gang leader vehemently denied any involvement in harming locals. Suddenly, a group of gangsters from the north, acting on Alvarez's orders, stormed in and started shooting at Mark. Luckily, he narrowly escaped the gunfire, leading to a frantic chase. Amidst the pursuit, Mark managed to immobilize one of the pursuers. Eventually, he found a hiding spot, evading the gangsters until they lost track of him. Not long after, the gang leader got in touch with Alvarez to report that they had lost sight of Mark. This news angered Alvarez, prompting him to command his gang to eliminate Mark's mother. Soon after, they arrived at Mark's house and barged in, firing at what they thought was Mark's sleeping mother. But upon closer inspection, they realized it was just a pillow, as Aquila, Mark's ex-girlfriend, had taken precautions to protect Mark's mother. Later on, we see Mark and B, the police chief, examining the crime scene at Mark's house. At that time, Mark can't help but think that if he hadn't entrusted his mother to Aquila, she might have become a victim. Then B informs Mark that he just received information from his informant about his brother's murder. As it turns out, there was a witness back then, a female singer named Nora. Then B reveals that Nora lives in a motel near the church, in room number 18. He suggests that Mark could talk to Nora directly to learn more about his brother's killer. The next day, we see Mark heading to Nora's room. At first, Nora hesitates to open the door, worried that Mark might be one of Alvarez's men. Soon after, Mark quickly shows his police badge to assure her he's not a threat. Then, Nora finally opens up, and they start talking. Mark promises to help Nora leave the island safely, as long as she's willing to reveal who really killed the bartender, who, as it turns out, was Mark's younger sibling. Nervously, Nora admits that Alvarez killed Mark's brother just because he accidentally spilled wine on her dress. She reveals that she's been trapped on the island because Alvarez fears she might report to the police. Upon learning this shocking truth, Mark swiftly gets Nora out of her room. He then meets up with B. Then Mark asks B to escort Nora to the pier and ensure she leaves the island without any trouble. Finally, B drives Nora to the pier, while Mark starts making his plans to seek revenge against Alvarez for his brother's death. Now the story shifts to Alvarez, who orders his trusted mercenaries to track down Mark. After a couple of hours, these mercenaries arrive on the island and head straight to Mark's house to find him. Meanwhile, Mark, his mother, and Aquila are together at his house. At that time, Mark plans to leave his mother in Aquila's care, as he's preparing to confront Alvarez. Suddenly, the sound of a car approaches, and it's the team of mercenaries sent by Alvarez. Quickly, Mark grabs a weapon and guides his mother and Aquila to the back of the house. Among the mercenaries, 2 stay with the car, while the other 2 proceed to enter the house. Inside, these 2 mercenaries discover signs that Mark went around the back of the house, prompting them to give chase. During the pursuit, the 2 mercenaries catch up to Mark, resulting in a gunfire exchange. Meanwhile, the other 2 mercenaries guarding the car encounter B. Suddenly, a gunfight ensues, but B manages to drive them away in the end. On the other hand, Mark was trying to take down one of the mercenaries, while the other one escapes. Then, B contacts him to check on his whereabouts. Mark responds that he's currently safeguarding his mother and Aquila at his best friend's house, who sells hot dogs. Soon after, the scene shifts to Alvarez and his right-hand man, who are in a hotel room looking for Nora. Alvarez gets furious upon discovering Nora's absence and doesn't hesitate to kill the hotel guard for failing to protect her. Back to Mark, who arrives at his best friend's place. He promptly leaves his mother and Aquila there, as he's now determined to seek vengeance for his brother's death from Alvarez. The hot dog seller warmly welcomes Mark's mother and Aquila. However, as Mark is about to leave, Aquila insists on joining him. At that time, Mark tries to dissuade her, but she persists, and they end up deciding to face the challenge together. In the evening, Mark and Aquila wait for Chief of Police B to arrive. Tonight, they've made a plan with B to take on Alvarez together. Soon, B arrives in his car, but he doesn't come out. Concerned, Mark and Aquila check on him. To their shock, they find B gravely wounded. Suddenly, gunfire erupts, and it's an attack from Alvarez's remaining 3 mercenaries. In the chaos, the mercenaries manage to capture Aquila, while Mark does his best to help the dying B. At that time, B urges Mark to continue the fight for justice and to save the island from ruthless people like Alvarez before passing away. The next day at a church, local residents are seen attending a service. Shortly after, Mark arrives and addresses the congregation. He speaks passionately, uniting them against being oppressed by outsiders. He rallies everyone to come together and confront Alvarez, the criminal behind illicit activities. This time, it's not just Mark's brother, but also B, the chief of police, and the kidnapped Aquila, who have suffered from Alvarez's actions. Upon hearing this, the residents agreed to join forces and stand up against Alvarez. Afterward, Mark headed to the police station, now temporarily taking over for B as the chief of police. He gathered his fellow officers and emphasized their focus on their new target, and it was Alvarez. While he was busy looking into information about Alvarez, his attention was drawn by Phil, his police partner from Los Angeles. Phil had deliberately come to find Mark, concerned about his prolonged absence from Los Angeles. Then, Mark explained that he wouldn't return until he had dealt with Alvarez, who had killed his brother and was holding Aquila hostage. Phil was on board to help Mark, seeing Mark's problem as his own. Later in the afternoon, Alvarez contacted Mark. It appeared that he had figured out that Mark was behind Nora's escape. Then he proposed a meeting at 7 a.m. the next day for an exchange Nora for Aquila. Alvarez promised to leave Mark alone after this exchange, as long as Mark agreed to forget everything he had done. While Mark reluctantly said yes to Alvarez's terms, he knew he would never truly forgive Alvarez until he had exacted his revenge. Plus, Nora had already left the island, making it impossible for Mark to bring her to the exchange the next morning. Soon after, Mark got in touch with Phil and asked him to assemble a team with the local police. At that time, he assigned Phil as the leader to rescue Aquila from Alvarez's grasp during their scheduled meeting at 7 a.m. the next day. Hearing that, Phil agreed to follow that instructions. The following day arrived, with Mark waiting at the designated spot to meet Alvarez. Meanwhile, Phil and his police team were attempting to infiltrate Alvarez's headquarters to free Aquila. Soon enough, they were confronted by one of Alvarez's mercenaries, but Phil managed to swiftly eliminate the threat. Back to Mark, he was now face to face with Alvarez and one of his right-hand men. Alvarez wasted no time inquiring about Nora's whereabouts. Soon after, Mark resorted to a fib, stating that Nora would show up once Aquila arrived. There he continued to buy time, as he anxiously awaited updates from Phil, who was in the midst of rescuing Aquila. The scene shifts to Phil's situation. Now, he had located Aquila, but faced a mercenary who had him at gunpoint. At that time, his options were limited, and he surrendered. Fortunately, they managed to eliminate the mercenaries eventually. Then Phil quickly updated Mark that Aquila was safe with him. Upon hearing this, Mark assured him that Nora was safe in Los Angeles and wouldn't return to the island. Also, Alvarez threatened to harm Aquila unless Mark complied. In a calm tone, Mark revealed that Alvarez's henchmen were no longer a threat, as they were all taken care of. Angered, Alvarez ordered his right-hand man to shoot Mark. However, he expertly incapacitated Alvarez's right-hand man. Just when it seemed the situation might turn dire, the unexpected happened. Suddenly, the hot dog seller and the island locals appeared, surrounding Alvarez with their weapons. Then, Mark urged everyone to lower their arms, proposing a duel between him and Alvarez to settle things once and for all. At that time, Alvarez reluctantly agreed to the challenge. Soon after, the duel began, and Mark replicated what Alvarez had done to his younger brother. In the following scene, Mark and Aquila were seen sharing an intimate moment by the beach. It became clear that they were officially a couple again and planning to marry soon. Soon after, Phil invited Mark back to Los Angeles, but Mark declined, expressing his commitment to stay and protect the island from outsiders seeking control. And with that, the film ends. The moral lesson from the film is if you spill wine on someone's dress, make sure they're not a mafia boss in disguise, or things might get seriously out of hand.